The morning Margaret Hayes turned 32, she counted pennies at her kitchen table while Montana snow gathered against the window like accusations. $2,347, the exact distance between her daughter's next meal and the landlord's final notice. December cold seeped through walls thin enough to hear neighbors arguing about things that didn't matter anymore. Who forgot to buy milk? Whose turn it was to take out trash? Small problems. Lucky problems. Lily sat across from her, tongue pressed between teeth in concentration, filling a princess castle with careful purple strokes. 7 years old and already practiced at pretending everything was fine. The space heater had quit 2 days ago. Maggie wore 3 layers and still shivered. Lily had her winter coat on indoors, but she colored like they were spending a cozy afternoon together, like this was normal, like children should have to choose between heat and electricity. The envelope arrived with the kind of weight that meant expensive paper, cream-colored, thick enough to survive the postal system without a single crease. The return address showed a law firm in Idaho, Ashford and Associates, Eastern 1898. Maggie turned it over twice before opening it, studying the wax seal like it might reveal whether this was another bill, another lawsuit from her ex-husband's lawyer, another door closing. Her fingers left smudges on the paper as she read. Her great-aunt Millicent, a woman whose name she'd never heard before this moment, had passed away 3 weeks ago. The formal language danced around what mattered. Millicent had left her something, not money, not jewelry, real estate in the mountains of Idaho, a property with historical significance and substantial acreage, according to the letter. Maggie read it 3 times, waiting for the catch to reveal itself in the fine print. The phone call came before she could finish reading. A voice that had clearly attended expensive schools, the kind where they taught you to make condescension sound like courtesy. "Miss Hayes, this is Robert Ashford from Ashford and Associates. We sent you documentation regarding your inheritance from Millicent Hayes." Maggie pressed the phone tighter against her ear. "I just got the letter. I don't understand. I never met my great-aunt." A pause, then a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "Miss Hayes, I need to be forthright with you. The property in question is, well, it's essentially a geological feature at this point. The house was buried in a mudslide back in 1924. We're talking about a hill of dirt in the middle of nowhere. No road access, no utilities. You'd be inheriting a tax burden, frankly." The heating bill on the table stared at her. Past due. 3rd notice. What kind of tax burden? Another pause. Longer this time. Perhaps 200 annually, but Miss Hayes, there's literally nothing there. We've been trying to sell the land for 20 years. No takers. Your great-aunt had particular ideas about who should inherit the property. She insisted it go to blood relatives only, but I'm obligated to inform you that accepting this inheritance would be, in my professional opinion, unwise. Maggie watched Lily add windows to the castle tower, each one carefully placed, each one a small act of hope that things could be beautiful if you worked hard enough. "How big is the property?" 40 acres. But Miss Hayes, I'll take it. The lawyer's voice sharpened. "I'm sorry. I'll take it. The inheritance. Whatever paperwork needs signing, send it." She could hear him breathing, weighing whether to argue. "Miss Hayes, I want to be absolutely clear. There is nothing of value on this property. The county records show a Victorian mansion underneath the earth, but it's been buried for a century. Even if someone wanted to excavate, which would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, there's no guarantee anything survived. You'd be accepting liability for land you can't use." Maggie counted the money on the table again. Still not enough. Still never enough. "Send the papers." The silence stretched until she thought he'd hung up. Then quietly, "All right, Miss Hayes, the property is yours. God help you." 3 days later, Maggie drove the 6 hours from Billings to the coordinates the lawyer had provided. Lily slept in the passenger seat, bundled in every blanket they owned, while the truck's heater wheezed against January cold that turned breath to frost inside the cab. The highway gave way to county roads, then to gravel, then to something that was barely a trail through pine forest so thick the afternoon sun came through in scattered pieces. The GPS died 2 miles before the destination. Maggie followed the printed map, second-guessing every turn until the trees opened onto a clearing that held nothing but snow and silence. A gentle hillside rose from flat ground, covered in the same white that blanketed everything else. Young pines dotted the slope. Wild grass poked through in patches. Nothing suggested human hands had ever touched this place. Lily woke as Maggie killed the engine. Mama? Her voice carried the confusion of interrupted sleep. Where's the house? Maggie climbed out into air so cold it hurt to breathe. 20 below, maybe colder. The snow crunched under her boots with the particular sound of deep freeze. She walked to the base of the hill, Lily trailing behind, and tried to see what the lawyer had described. A mansion, 3 stories, Victorian architecture. All of it under her feet somewhere, buried like a secret the earth had decided to keep. She knelt in the snow, pulling Lily close. You see this hill, baby? Lily nodded, eyes wide. There's a house sleeping under there, like a treasure that's been waiting. Lily's face transformed. Can we wake it up? Something shifted in Maggie's chest. Not hope. She'd learned better than that. But something close to it, something that felt like the opposite of giving up. Yeah, sweetheart, let's wake it up. The hardware store in the nearest town was 20 miles back the way they'd come. Walt Brennan ran it, a man who looked like he'd been 68 years old for the past 3 decades. Gray hair cropped military short, hands that had built things and broken things and knew the difference. He watched Maggie browse the tool section with the expression of someone who'd seen enough foolishness to recognize it on sight. She carried 2 shovels to the counter. He rang them up without comment until she handed over her credit card. Then he glanced at the name, back at her face, and his expression shifted into something she couldn't read. You're buying shovels in January? Not a question. I need to dig something. He looked at her like she'd announced plans to swim to China. In this weather? Ground's frozen solid, Miss Hayes. You'd need a jackhammer just to crack the surface. The use of her name made her pause. How did you— Small town. Word travels when lawyers start calling around about the old Ashford property. He handed back her card. You're the one who inherited the buried house. The way he said it, not mocking, but not kind either, made her spine straighten. That's right. Walt shook his head slowly. Lady, I've lived here 40 years. That property's been a joke longer than that. There's nothing under that hill but dirt and disappointment. You'd be better off selling it to some fool from California who wants to pretend he's buying history. Maggie picked up the shovels. They were heavier than she'd expected. Everything was heavier than expected these days. I can't sell what nobody wants to buy, so I'm going to dig. He studied her with eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by bravado. But something in his expression softened, just slightly. These are on loan. Bring them back when you realize this is crazy. The Facebook post appeared that night. A photo of Maggie's truck at the hillside, taken from the road by someone passing. The caption read, Local woman thinks she's an archaeologist, trying to dig up a 100-year-old house with hand tools LOL. 43 shares before midnight. By morning it was 80. At the grocery store where Maggie worked nights, her coworker Jennifer watched her stock shelves with a mixture of pity and fascination. Honey, people are talking. Maggie focused on rotating cans, oldest to the front, exactly like the manager wanted. Let them. They're saying you've lost it, that you're wasting time on some fantasy instead of finding real work. Real work. Maggie had 3 jobs. She fixed her own car because mechanics cost money. She patched her own roof because roofers cost more. She worked 18-hour days and still couldn't keep the lights on. What do they suggest I do instead? Jennifer didn't have an answer for that. Nobody ever did. Maggie's mother called that evening, voice tight with the particular disappointment reserved for daughters who refused to make sensible choices. Sarah, honey, I'm worried about you. Nobody called her Sarah except her mother. I'm fine, Mom. You're not fine. You're digging in the snow for a house that probably doesn't exist. Emma's teacher called me. She's concerned about the child missing school to help you with this project. Lily goes to school every day. But after school, Sarah, you're taking her to that frozen hill instead of getting her home where it's warm. Instead of looking for better employment. Instead of accepting that sometimes you have to cut your losses and move on. Maggie closed her eyes. Her mother meant well. That made it worse somehow. The house is there, Mom. The county records confirm it. Under 100 years of earth. Even if you could dig it up, and you can't, what good would it do? You need money now. You need stability. You need to focus on real solutions, not fairy tales. After she hung up, Maggie sat in the dark of her apartment, listening to Lily's steady breathing from the bedroom they shared. Real solutions. As if she hadn't tried everything else. As if desperation hadn't already exhausted every practical option. The buried house was crazy, yes. Impossible, probably. But it was hers. The first thing she'd owned in years that wasn't a bill or a broken promise. The first evening she drove Lily to the property after school, the temperature had dropped to 18 below. Maggie parked as close as she could, which still meant a 100-yard walk through knee-deep snow. She'd packed thermoses of hot chocolate, hand warmers, extra blankets. They looked like Arctic explorers heading to the corner store. The snow had drifted to 2 feet deep in places. Underneath, the ground was frozen into something harder than concrete. Maggie drove the shovel down with her full weight and managed to scrape away perhaps 3 inches. The metal rang against frozen earth. Her shoulders absorbed the shock. She tried again. Same result. Lily watched for a moment, then retrieved the beach bucket Maggie had found at a yard sale. Bright pink plastic with a cartoon mermaid. Completely wrong for the job, but all they had. She began scooping snow aside, creating a small pile while Maggie chipped at the permafrost beneath. They worked until dark stole the light, making perhaps 6 inches of progress over a square foot of ground. Maggie's hands blistered that first night. By the end of the week, they'd calloused. Her back ached constantly, the kind of deep pain that made sleep difficult and mornings worse. But every evening, they returned. Maggie would pick Lily up from school, drive the 20 miles, and dig until her daughter complained of cold, or hunger, or exhaustion. Progress was measured in fractions. An inch here, 2 inches there. The hill remained exactly as it had looked for the past century, untouched, indifferent, immense. The memes multiplied. Someone photoshopped Maggie's face onto a cartoon archaeologist. Another showed her digging to China. The town's Facebook group debated whether this was shirkin, crazy, or both. The consensus leaned toward both. But on the evening of the 7th day, something changed. Lily had wandered from their excavation site, poking at the snow with a stick, when she called out, "Mama, look!" Maggie straightened, back protesting. Lily held something small and red in her mittened hand. At first glance, it looked like a stone. When Maggie took it, brushed away the ice, she felt the unmistakable texture of fired clay. A brick, old, weathered, with edges that had once been sharp before time rounded them. She turned it over, heart suddenly loud in her ears. If there were bricks, there had been walls. If there had been walls, there was a house. Not maybe, not probably. Was. Lily's eyes shone. "We found it, Mama. We found the house." Not yet. Not even close. But for the first time since the lawyer's call, Maggie felt something that might actually be hope rather than just its desperate cousin. She knelt in the snow, pulled Lily into a hug, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that impossible might be negotiable after all. The second week brought colder temperatures and a storm that buried their excavation site under fresh powder. Maggie arrived to find every inch of progress erased. The hill returned to its smooth, indifferent state. She stood at the truck, Lily waiting inside where it was marginally warmer, and considered the very real possibility that this was madness, that her mother was right, that she should take what dignity remained and walk away. Then she picked up the shovel and started over. Lily joined her after 10 minutes, bucket in hand, because that's what they did now. They dug. It had become their routine, their ritual, their rebellion against a world that had told them to accept their lot. The snow fell around them. They cleared it. The ground stayed frozen. They chipped at it anyway. On day 9, Walt Brennan's truck appeared at the edge of the property just as twilight was claiming the last light. Maggie tensed, ready for him to demand his shovels back, ready to be told she'd proven herself the fool he'd predicted. Instead, he climbed out carrying a third shovel and a thermos that steamed in the cold. He walked to where they worked, surveyed the shallow depression they'd managed to create, maybe 3 feet across, 8 inches deep, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he drove his shovel into the frozen earth with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done hard labor before. The blade bit deeper than Maggie had managed all week. He worked without speaking. After an hour, he'd moved more earth than she'd accomplished in 3 days. When he finally paused, he poured coffee from the thermos and handed it to her. "You're doing this wrong." Maggie wrapped her frozen fingers around the cup. "I'm doing it the only way I know how." "You're trying to dig straight down. Winter ground doesn't work like that." He pointed at the slope. "You need to go at an angle. Let gravity help instead of fighting it. Build a ramp, not a hole." "I don't know how to build a ramp." Walt looked at her the way sergeants must look at raw recruits. "Then it's a good thing I do." He didn't explain why he'd come, didn't offer apologies for his earlier skepticism. He just showed her how to read the land, how to work with the freeze instead of against it, how to make each motion count for something. By the time Lily fell asleep in the truck, they'd tripled their excavation site. As Walt packed up to leave, he paused at his truck. "I knew Millicent Hayes." Maggie's breath caught. "You did?" "My wife was friends with her before." He didn't finish the sentence. "Millicent used to talk about this place, about the family history, about waiting for the right person to claim it." His eyes met hers. "I didn't think that person existed." "I'm not sure you're her either, but you're stubborn enough to make me wonder." He left before Maggie could ask what he meant. The next evening, Walt was there when they arrived, and the evening after that, on the fourth night, he brought a propane heater and a tarp, showing them how to create a makeshift greenhouse that would warm the ground before they dug. The work went faster. Not fast. Nothing about this was fast, but faster. On day 15, Eleanor Kim arrived just as they were packing up. She taught second grade at Lily's school and had the kind of gentle firmness that made children want to behave and parents want to confess their failures. She carried work gloves and wore boots that meant business. "I heard you could use help." She didn't wait for permission, just picked up a shovel and started working. Her teenage son Josh followed, lanky and silent, but his young muscles made quick work of the frozen earth. They stayed for 2 hours. In that time, they moved more dirt than Maggie had managed in a week alone. When they left, Eleanor simply said, "Same time tomorrow." Word spread differently after that. Not mockery this time, but something more complicated. Curiosity mixed with grudging respect, mixed with the human tendency to gather around unlikely spectacles. On day 17, 2 more people showed up. Day 18 brought 5. By the end of week 3, Maggie had a rotation of volunteers. 12 people who would arrive after work, dig until dark, then disappear back to their normal lives. Marcus, the retired mechanic, brought a wheelbarrow. The Baptist Church youth group made it their service project. Helen, who worked as a nurse, brought a first aid kit and worried aloud about hypothermia while moving dirt like she was excavating bodies from rubble. Even some of the people who'd mocked her initially started showing up, unable to resist the pull of something that refused to die quietly. Walt orchestrated them like a military campaign. He divided the volunteers into shifts, assigned tasks based on ability, made sure nobody worked long enough to risk frostbite. Under his direction, they created a terraced excavation system, 3 levels descending at angles that wouldn't collapse under snow weight. They built drainage channels for when the thaw came. They worked with precision that transformed foolishness into something that looked almost professional. On day 23, Maggie was 6 feet down in the pit they'd created when her shovel hit something that rang different from frozen earth. The sound echoed, metal on metal, and everyone stopped. She dropped to her knees, the cold forgotten, and scraped at the spot with gloved hands. Then with bare hands, because she needed to feel it, needed to confirm. The ground resisted, but she dug with fingernails and determination until color appeared beneath the white and brown. Green. Not the green of oxidized copper, but close, patina over metal that had been underground for a century. She cleared more, breathing hard enough to create clouds. The metal curved. She followed it. The curve continued. She cleared a square foot, then 2, revealing a section of roof, decorative, intricate, still intact. "I found it." Her voice came out as a whisper, then louder. "I found it! I found the house!" Lily, who'd been at the pit's edge with Eleanor, started jumping and clapping. The sound carried across the excavation site. Volunteers gathered, silent now, staring at what Maggie had uncovered. Walt climbed down beside her, knelt, ran his own hands over the metal. "Sweet, merciful Christ," he said quietly. "It's real. The house is real." Someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then everyone, the sound strange and bright in the frozen evening air. Maggie stayed kneeling in the snow, hands pressed against metal that proved she hadn't been crazy after all. Or if she had been crazy, the world had decided to reward madness for once. That night, the Facebook post changed. Instead of mockery, there was wonder. Instead of memes, there were photos of the exposed roofline, zoomed in to show the craftsmanship that had survived burial. The story spread beyond the town. Local news picked it up, then regional, then a wire service that sent it across the country. Single mother discovers mansion buried for a century beneath Montana snow. They got the facts wrong. It was Idaho, not Montana, and Maggie lived in Montana, but that seemed too complicated to explain. But the essence was right enough. Someone had refused to give up. Someone had dug when everyone said stop. Someone had been rewarded for persistence with proof. The excavation became the unofficial project of an entire community. The local construction company donated an excavator for a weekend, moving in 2 days what would have taken months by hand. The fire department volunteered their pumps for when groundwater started seeping into the dig site. Everyone wanted to see what emerged from the earth. What emerged defied expectations in ways that made the news coverage seem understated. The house revealed itself in sections, like a photograph developing in chemicals. First the roof, copper shingles aged to verde, but still intact, still beautiful. Then the third floor windows, glass somehow unbroken despite the weight of a century's worth of soil. Then the gingerbread trim that gave Victorian mansions their particular fussiness, all of it preserved because the mudslide had packed around the structure rather than crushing it. By late February, they'd exposed the entire facade. 3 stories of architectural ambition, frozen in time, covered in a century of dirt, but fundamentally intact. The mudslide had hit from the north, driving snow and mud through windows and doors, filling the interior with sediment that had then frozen, thawed, refrozen, and eventually settled into something like concrete. But the frame had held, the walls had held, the house had survived its burial. Walt explained it one evening as they stood looking at their progress, the exposed mansion rising from the pit they'd created like something from a fairy tale. The angle saved it. The slide came from uphill, pushed everything inside but didn't collapse the structure. Then the freeze locked it in place. It's been in a time capsule for 99 years. Maggie couldn't stop staring. This was hers, this impossible, beautiful, stubborn thing that had refused to disappear. Can we get inside? We'll need to clear the entrance. Carefully. The door's probably still locked. They worked for 3 more days before the front door was accessible. Victorian oak, brass hardware tarnished but intact, the kind of door that spoke of money and taste and permanence. Walt examined the lock with the care of a surgeon, using tools Maggie didn't recognize to work the mechanism without forcing it. The lock clicked. The sound seemed too small for the moment. Walt pushed. The door resisted, swollen from moisture and time, then gave way with a groan that might have been protest or welcome. Cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of earth and age and secrets kept too long. Maggie stepped inside first, Lily's hand tight in hers, flashlight cutting through darkness that had lasted a century. The interior stopped her breath. Mud and dried sediment filled the space from floor to waist height, creating a new ground level that bisected the original room. But from waist to ceiling, the air was clear. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left. A sofa, chairs, tables all rising from the dried mud like shipwrecks at low tide. Paintings still hung on walls. A chandelier dangled from the ceiling. Crystals dulled, but unbroken. The dining room held a table set for 12, each place setting complete with china that had cups filled with hardened sediment instead of tea. The pattern was delicate, expensive, the kind of thing Maggie had only seen in museums. Silverware waited beside each plate. The head of the table held what might have been a wine glass, the contents long since dried to a brown stain. Lily whispered, "It's like they just walked away." Walt moved through the space with his flashlight, illuminating corners that hadn't seen light since before the First World War. They probably did. When a mudslide hits, you run. You don't stop to pack. They explored room by room, flashlights revealing wonders and mysteries in equal measure. The parlor held a piano, A grand piano, black lacquer finish, cracked, but the strings probably still functional. Books lined shelves in what must have been a library, leather-bound volumes that would take years to catalog. A study contained a desk with papers still spread across its surface, the ink long faded but the shape of writing still visible. And behind the desk, set into the wall and concealed behind a painting of mountains that might have been these very mountains, was a safe. Maggie's flashlight beam caught it, and her heart lurched. Safes meant valuables. Valuables meant money or jewelry, or something that could be sold to pay for heat and food, and the thousand small desperations that had driven her here in the first place. Walt crossed the room, examined the safe with the same careful attention he'd given the front door. It was large, old, the kind of thing that would have taken serious money to install. The combination lock looked functional despite its age. They searched the desk, moving carefully around dried mud and papers brittle with time. In the top drawer, beneath a glass paperweight that had protected it from the worst of the moisture, was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was spidery, faded, but legible under their lights. To whoever finds this house. Maggie's hands shook as she read, "If you are reading this, you have been brave enough to dig when others would not. I leave this for you, knowing that courage deserves reward more than caution ever could. The combination to the safe, 1847-33. Everything I have left is inside. Use it more wisely than I did. Learn from my failures. Build something that lasts longer than pride. But be warned, there are those who will claim right to what you find. Those who carry the name Blackwell. Do not trust them. They took from me once. They will take from you if given the chance. I leave this knowing I will never see it again. The snow is falling. The slide has buried my home. I am an old man with nothing but regrets and this final hope that someone, someday, will find what I have hidden and make better choices than I made." Nathaniel Ashford, December 15, 1924. Maggie read it twice while Walt looked over her shoulder. The name Blackwell made her stomach tighten, though she didn't know why. Some instinct that recognized warning even without understanding the threat. Walt's face had gone pale. "Blackwell," he said quietly. "Jesus Christ. You know that name?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried weight that suggested history and hurt. "There's a Theodore Blackwell in town, owns most of the commercial property, big man in local politics." He paused. "I didn't know there was a connection to the Ashford family." Maggie turned to the safe. The numbers from the letter seemed to burn in her mind. 1847-33. She approached it slowly, Lily pressed against her side and reached for the dial. The metal was cold under her fingers. She turned it right to 18. The mechanism clicked, old but functional. Left to 47, another click, right to 33. The final click seemed louder than the others. She pulled the handle. It resisted for a moment, rust, age, reluctance, then gave. The door swung open with a groan that echoed through the frozen house. Inside were stacks of paper. Not money. Maggie's heart sank until she saw what the papers were. Stock certificates, hundreds of them, bound in bundles with string that had rotted but still held. She pulled out the first stack, brought it to Walt's light. Union Pacific Railroad Company. Stock certificate, issued June 15, 1898. Another stack, Standard Oil Company, 1902. Another, Carnegie Steel Corporation, 1905. Walt's breathing had gone shallow. "These are, Maggie, do you know what these might be worth?" She didn't. She pulled out more stacks. Railroad companies, oil companies, steel companies. Names she recognized from history books. Names that had built America's industrial age. All of them dated from before the First World War, before the Depression, before the house had been buried. At the bottom of the safe, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the moisture, was a leather journal. Maggie opened it carefully. The first page bore a name in the same spidery handwriting, Nathaniel Ashford. She turned pages, reading by flashlight, while Walt held the beam steady. It was part memoir, part confession, part warning to whoever found it. The journal told a story of ambition and betrayal. Nathaniel had built a railroad empire from nothing, amassing wealth that would be worth hundreds of millions in modern currency. But in 1923, he'd trusted the wrong partner. Oliver Blackwell, who'd convinced him to invest in opportunities that turned out to be fraud. Nathaniel lost $7 million in 6 months. Everything except these stock certificates, which he'd held back as a final reserve. He'd planned to sell them to pay his debts. Then the mudslide came. The house was buried. His wife and daughter evacuated safely, but Nathaniel returned for the safe. He'd been too late. The snow and mud had already claimed the structure. He lived 3 more months, dying of a heart attack in poverty, the location of his last fortune literally buried with his home. The final entry stopped Maggie's breath. "I leave this for whoever is brave enough to dig for it. May they have the courage I lacked to start over. May they use wealth for building rather than hoarding. And may they remember the Blackwell family will seek to claim what they believe is theirs. They took from me through lies. They will try to take from you through law. Trust no one who shares that name." Maggie closed the journal, her mind racing. If these certificates were still valid, and that was a massive if, they could be worth something. Enough to pay bills, enough to change her life, enough to make this insanity worthwhile. She pulled out her phone, surprised it still had signal this far from civilization, and called the number on one of the certificates. A customer service line that probably received strange calls, but surely none quite like this. The representative listened to her explanation with professional skepticism that gradually shifted to something else. She read certificate numbers, waited while keyboards clicked, waited while the representative conferred with someone else, waited while her heart tried to beat its way through her ribs. When the representative came back on the line, her voice had changed. Professional courtesy had been replaced by something like awe. "Miss Hayes, I need to transfer you to our Historical Instruments Division. But I can tell you preliminarily that these certificates, if authenticated, have split multiple times over the past century. They've been accruing value through stock splits, mergers, and acquisitions for 99 years. What does that mean?" A pause, then carefully. "It means you may want to speak with a lawyer. These could be worth, Miss Hayes, at current market value, a conservative estimate would be approximately $15 million. The world went quiet. Not silent. Maggie could still hear wind outside, still hear Lily breathing beside her, still hear Walt's sharp intake of breath. But everything seemed distant, muffled, unreal. $15 million. She'd been counting pennies that morning. She'd been 3 weeks from eviction. She'd been 1 car breakdown away from losing her last job. And now she was holding enough money to never count pennies again. Lily looked up at her with eyes that understood something important had happened without grasping what. "Mama, are you okay?" Maggie pulled her daughter close, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. "Yeah, baby, we're okay. For the first time in a long time, we're actually okay." But even as she said it, Nathaniel's warning echoed in her mind. The Blackwell family will seek to claim what they believe is theirs. She looked at Walt, saw the concern on his face, and knew this wasn't over. Finding the fortune was only the beginning of whatever came next. News traveled faster than Maggie could process what the discovery meant. By the time they'd locked the mansion and driven back to town, her phone had 17 missed calls. Reporters, financial advisors, people claiming to be distant relatives she'd never heard of, and one message from a law firm in Boise that made her hands shake when she listened to it. The firm represented Douglas Hayes, her cousin, allegedly, a man she'd never met, never heard mentioned, who was very interested in discussing their shared inheritance from the Ashford estate. Walt drove her and Lily home in silence. When they reached her apartment building, paint peeling, heating still broken, exactly as shabby as it had been that morning when she was poor, he finally spoke. "Don't talk to anyone until you have your own lawyer. Not reporters, not financial people, especially not anyone named Hayes who suddenly remembers you exist." Maggie nodded, numb. $15 million. The number kept circling her brain, too large to feel real. She'd spent years measuring wealth and whether she could afford the name brand cereal. This was lottery winner money, generational wealth money. Never worry again money. Except Nathaniel's warning suggested she should worry plenty. Sleep didn't come. Maggie lay in bed listening to Lily's breathing and trying to reconcile the woman who'd counted pennies this morning with whatever she was becoming now. Rich, presumably. protected from the daily humiliations of poverty. But the certificates were still in the safe. The safe was still in the buried house, and ownership of both remained a question that lawyers would have to answer. The knock came at 7 in the morning. Maggie opened the door to find a man in his early 50s, wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. He had the kind of smile that real estate agents perfected, friendly without warmth, professional without sincerity. "Margaret Hayes, I'm Douglas Hayes. I believe we're family." He held out genealogy documents before she could close the door. A family tree that showed his line and hers branching from the same root. Nathaniel Ashford's children. Douglas descended from Nathaniel's son, Maggie from Nathaniel's daughter, both legitimate heirs, according to the paperwork he'd brought. "I understand you've made quite a discovery. I wanted to discuss how we might resolve this situation amicably. May I come in?" Everything in Maggie's gut screamed no, but curiosity won over caution. She let him inside, watched him take in her sparse furniture and broken heater with an expression carefully neutral. Douglas settled onto her second-hand couch like he was visiting a museum of poverty. "I'll be direct, Margaret. By law, both of us have legitimate claims to the Ashford estate. I've consulted with attorneys who confirm that Idaho inheritance law would split the property and any valuables discovered therein equally among direct descendants of the same generation." Maggie's throat tightened. "Millicent left it to me in her will." Millicent had no legal right to bequeath property she didn't own. The estate was never properly probated after Nathaniel's death. Technically, it should have been divided among all his heirs in 1925. That never happened. He pulled out more documents. "I'm prepared to be reasonable. 60-40 split in your favor, given the work you put into excavation. That's more than fair. And if I disagree?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then we go to court. A judge will likely order 50-50, or worse, freeze the assets entirely until the case is resolved. That could take 3 to 5 years. Meanwhile, neither of us sees a penny, and you're stuck maintaining a property you can't afford to preserve." He stood, leaving the documents on her coffee table. "Think it over. But don't wait too long. Every day you delay is a day the court could decide you're acting in bad faith." After he left, Maggie picked up the papers with shaking hands. The genealogy looked legitimate. The legal citations checked out when she searched them online. Douglas Hayes was exactly what he claimed to be. Another heir with potentially equal rights to everything she'd found. The universe, it seemed, couldn't let her have this one thing without a fight. Walt arrived an hour later with coffee in the name of a lawyer in Boise. "Sarah Yoon. She's young but sharp. Won't charge you an arm and a leg just to tell you you're screwed." Sarah turned out to be 32, Maggie's age exactly, with the kind of intensity that suggested she'd clawed her way through law school on scholarships and spite. She listened to Maggie's story, reviewed Douglas's documents, and delivered her assessment with brutal efficiency. "He's not wrong about the inheritance law, but Millicent's will was written in 2018, after Idaho updated its probate statutes. The new law allows testators to designate specific heirs for previously undistributed estates if they can demonstrate direct knowledge and intent. Millicent knew about the buried house. She specifically chose you. That matters. So I keep everything?" Sarah's expression said it wouldn't be that simple. "We can argue it, but Douglas will argue back. This goes to court. It's a coin flip. Maybe 60-40 in your favor. Maybe 50-50. Maybe the judge gets creative and orders something neither of us expects. What do you recommend?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. "Depends what you want. If you want certainty and you're willing to compromise, take Douglas's offer. 60% of $15 million is still $9 million. Life-changing money. If you want to fight on principle, we fight. But understand you might lose, and you'll definitely spend the next 2 years in legal limbo." Maggie thought about her broken heater, her overdue bills, Lily's worn-out coat. $9 million would solve every problem she'd ever had, but 40% would go to a man who'd done nothing except share DNA and hire a lawyer fast enough to stake a claim. "I need time to think." The decision was made for her 3 days later when the county served papers freezing the Ashford estate pending resolution of competing ownership claims. Douglas had filed his lawsuit. The mansion, the certificates, everything was locked down until a judge decided who owned what. Maggie couldn't access the safe, couldn't sell the stocks, couldn't do anything except watch her window of escape slam shut. The second complication arrived in a Mercedes that cost more than most houses. Theodore Blackwell stepped out wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than Maggie's car, surveying the excavation site with the expression of a man calculating profit margins. He found Maggie restacking equipment in what had become a storage area near the exposed mansion. Up close, Blackwell radiated the kind of power that came from money so old it had stopped being vulgar and become respectable. 55 distinguished silver at his temples, the posture of someone who'd never doubted his right to take up space. Miss Hayes, quite an accomplishment. I wanted to congratulate you personally on the discovery. Maggie straightened, trowel still in hand. Thank you. Of course, managing 15 million requires certain expertise, connections, the kind of financial acumen that comes from experience. His smile was all teeth. I'd be happy to help structure your investments. 20% management fee is standard for assets of this size. 20%. $3 million just for telling her what to do with her own money. I appreciate the offer, but I haven't decided. Miss Hayes, small-town single mothers rarely have experience with wealth management. No offense intended, but making the wrong decisions now could cost you everything. Bad investments, poor tax planning. The IRS alone could take half if you're not careful. He handed her a business card embossed with gold lettering. My firm has managed generational wealth for families in this region for over a century. We understand the complexities. Something about the phrasing nagged at her. A century, the same time frame as Nathaniel's journal. Your family has been in wealth management that long? My great-grandfather started the business, yes. Oliver Blackwell. He understood the importance of preserving capital through difficult times. Maggie's blood went cold. Oliver Blackwell, the man who'd defrauded Nathaniel, the man whose betrayal had destroyed the Ashford fortune, and now his great-grandson stood here offering to manage what little remained. She forced her expression neutral. I'll think about it. Theodore's smile sharpened. Don't think too long. Opportunities like this require decisive action. Hesitation costs money. After he left, Maggie found Walt checking the drainage system they'd installed. She told him about the conversation, watched his face go hard. The Blackwells have been vultures in this town for 3 generations. Theodore's father, Marcus, tried to buy up properties during the 2008 crash, foreclosing on families who'd lived here for decades. Theodore's worse. He's got the veneer of respectability his father never managed. Do you think he knows it about the journal? About what Oliver did to Nathaniel? Walt's jaw worked. I think the Blackwells have known about that buried house for a century. I think they've been waiting for someone to dig it up so they could find a way to take what's inside. The town council meeting happened on a Thursday. Maggie attended because Sarah had insisted she needed to see the opposition's tactics firsthand. The council was voting on permits for property restoration and historic preservation. Paperwork Maggie needed to actually do anything with the mansion beyond, leave it as an excavated curiosity. Theodore Blackwell sat in the front row, perfectly pressed suit and expression of civic concern. When Maggie's permits came up for consideration, he stood. I want to state for the record my support for historic preservation. However, I have concerns about the environmental impact assessment. The excavation has disrupted groundwater flow. We need proper geological surveys before approving further construction. His tone was reasonable, his points technically valid, his intent transparently obstructionist. The council voted 3-2 to table the permits pending additional studies. Studies that would cost thousands of dollars Maggie couldn't access because of the freeze on the estate. Afterward, Sarah pulled Maggie aside, fury barely contained. He controls 3 of those 5 votes. He just demonstrated he can block anything you try to do with the property indefinitely. Maggie felt the trap closing. What do I do? Fight him on every front, but understand he's got resources you don't. Money, influence, time. Men like Theodore Blackwell don't lose because they can't afford to. The walls kept closing. Douglas's lawsuit, Theodore's obstruction, the daily reality of still being poor despite theoretical millions locked in certificates she couldn't touch. Maggie went to work at the grocery store, came home to her cold apartment, Tried to explain to Lily why they couldn't fix the heat even though Mommy had found treasure. The treasure has to wait, baby. Grown-up problems. Lily, 8 years old now and wise beyond her years, nodded with the kind of acceptance that broke Maggie's heart. Children shouldn't have to understand that finding millions didn't mean having dollars. Walt showed up on a Friday evening, grim-faced and carrying a wooden box Maggie had never seen. He set it on her kitchen table, the kind of careful that suggested significance. "I need to tell you something I should have said from the start." Maggie sat down, suddenly certain she didn't want to hear this. Walt opened the box. Inside were photographs, letters, and a journal of his own, military issue, the kind soldiers carried in combat. "In 1975, I was 18 and fresh back from Vietnam. Millicent Hayes hired me to find the buried house. I searched for 5 years, never found it." He pulled out a photograph, a younger Walt standing next to a woman in her 60s, both holding maps. Millicent knew exactly where the house was. She'd been trying to locate it since the 1950s. But there was someone else looking too. Marcus Blackwell. The name hit like cold water. Theodore's father. Marcus believed his father Oliver had hidden gold in the Ashford mansion before the mudslide. Oliver told Marcus on his deathbed, "Everything I took from Ashford is still in that house." Marcus spent 40 years looking for it. Walt's hands shook slightly as he pulled out more documents. In 1980, Marcus came to me, said if I found the house, I had to tell him first. Offered to split whatever was inside 50-50. I refused. He swallowed hard. 2 weeks later, my wife was in a car accident. Brake lines failed. She survived, but never walked again. The police called it mechanical failure. I knew better. Maggie's stomach turned. Marcus cut her brake lines? Could never prove it. But the day after the accident, he visited me in the hospital, stood by my wife's bed and said, "Terrible how quickly things can fall apart. You should be more careful who you refuse." Walt's eyes were wet now. Millicent told me to stop looking, said the house would reveal itself when the right person came along, someone who needed it badly enough to dig without promises of gold. He pushed the box toward Maggie. "You were that person, but I should have warned you what you were digging into. The Blackwells have been circling this property for 3 generations. Theodore knows about the journal. He knows what his great-grandfather did, and he'll do whatever it takes to make sure that story stays buried." Maggie looked at the contents of the bunk, decades of searching, danger, obsession. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Marcus died 5 years ago, and I thought that was the end of it. But Theodore's playing the same game, just with better lawyers and fake concern about environmental impacts." Walt met her eyes. "You need to know what you're fighting. This isn't just about money. It's about family legacy and buried guilt and secrets that powerful people will kill to protect." The word kill hung in the air between them. Maggie's phone rang before she could respond. Sarah Yoon, calling after business hours. Never a good sign. The court date's set for Douglas's claim, May 15th, but there's something else. The bank that's authenticating the stock certificates called. They need the original journal for provenance. Without it, they can't confirm the certificates weren't forged or stolen. The journal's in the safe, which is in the house, which is part of the frozen estate. Douglas's lawyer is arguing that removing anything from the property before ownership is determined constitutes theft. Sarah's frustration bled through the phone. "They've got us boxed in. We can't prove ownership without the journal. We can't get the journal without proving ownership." After hanging up, Maggie sat in the dark of her apartment, Walt's revelations and Sarah's news spinning through her mind. She'd found $15 million and somehow ended up more trapped than when she was just poor. Walt cleared his throat. "There's one more thing in the box." He pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with age. A map, not of the surrounding area, but of the mansion's interior. Rooms labeled in faded ink, and in the basement, a notation that made Maggie's pulse spike. Hidden cellar, underground railroad station. Millicent found this in county records from 1862. Catherine Ashford, Nathaniel's wife, ran a station on the Underground Railroad. She helped escaped slaves reach Canada. The hidden cellar was where she hid them. Maggie studied the map, something clicking into place. If there's a hidden cellar, there might be another entrance, another way into the house that doesn't go through the main floor. Walt nodded slowly. The freeze only covers removing valuables. It doesn't say we can't explore the property. If we found a historical preservation reason to excavate the basement, they sat in silence, both understanding what wasn't being said. The journal was evidence, evidence that could prove Maggie's ownership and destroy Theodore's family reputation simultaneously. If they could get it out of the safe without technically violating the court order, they might break the deadlock. It was probably illegal, definitely risky, and absolutely necessary. The excavation of the basement began under the guise of historical documentation. Walt called in favors from the State Historical Society, who sent an archaeologist to assess potential Underground Railroad significance. Bobby Chen, the local contractor who donated equipment early on, volunteered his crew for preservation work. They dug for 2 weeks, carefully removing packed earth from what the map suggested was the north side of the foundation. The work went slowly. This wasn't treasure hunting anymore, but archaeology, each layer documented and photographed. The Historical Society archaeologists supervised with the kind of academic precision that made Walt grind his teeth. But on day 13, they found it. A brick wall, different from the mansion's foundation. Older, rougher, with a gap that suggested a deliberate opening rather than structural damage. The archaeologist, Dr. Helen Martinez, 50 and fierce about historical accuracy, examined the wall with growing excitement. This is consistent with pre-Civil War construction techniques. If this is what I think it is, they cleared the opening carefully. Behind the bricks was a space perhaps 6 feet by 8, ceiling so low Walt had to crouch. The walls were marked with names written in what looked like charcoal. Samuel, April, 1859. Mary and Son, June 1860. Rebecca, Christmas, 1858. Dozens of names, each representing someone who'd hidden here, waiting for the next leg of a journey toward freedom. Maggie stood in that cramped space, flashlight illuminating names that had been buried for over a century, and felt the weight of what Catherine Ashford had risked. This wasn't just history. It was evidence of courage that could get you killed, documented and preserved by a woman who'd understood that some things were worth dying for. Dr. Martinez was documenting the names with trembling hands. This is extraordinary. I need to call the Smithsonian. This could be one of the best preserved Underground Railroad stations in the Northwest. How long will that take? Maggie tried to keep the urgency from her voice. Months, maybe a year. We'll need to catalog every mark, cross-reference with historical records, establish provenance. Walt interrupted gently. What about immediate documentation, photos, measurements, that kind of thing? Helen looked at him like he'd suggested burning the site. That's the bare minimum. This deserves proper scholarly attention. Agreed, Ikain. But while you're setting that up, can we at least secure the space? Make sure nothing's damaged before the full team arrives? Helen considered, then nodded. I suppose that's reasonable, but nothing gets moved or altered until I have proper equipment. She left to make calls, leaving Maggie and Walt in the hidden cellar. Walt pulled out his own flashlight, playing the beam over walls Maggie had already examined. There. He pointed to a corner where the bricks didn't quite align. That's not original construction. Someone bricked over something. They worked the loose bricks free carefully, aware that Helen could return any moment. Behind the false wall was a metal box, rusted but intact. Walt lifted it out, surprised by the weight. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the moisture, was another journal. Catherine Ashford's name was written on the first page in elegant script. Maggie's hands shook as she opened it, reading by flashlight. December 1858. Nathaniel is in Chicago for 2 weeks. I received 3 souls from the station south of here. They hide in the cellar I convinced Nathaniel to build for wine storage. He suspects nothing. How could he? His fortune is built on steel from foundries that use slave labor, on cotton from plantations that break bodies for profit. He is a good man who does not see the evil that enriches him. I cannot make him see. But I can do this one thing. I can help those who run toward freedom, and I can document their courage so that someday someone will know their names. Maggie flipped through more entries, each one detailing people Catherine had helped, money she'd paid to guides, close calls with slave catchers. And then, near the middle, an entry that made her breath stop. January 1859. Oliver Blackwell discovered my secret. I was careless, and he followed me to the cellar. He threatened to report me to the authorities unless I paid him $500. I gave him the money from my household account. It was the first payment. He returns each month now, bleeding me like a parasite. This is how the Blackwell fortune grows, not through honest work, but through extorting those who do right while he does nothing. More entries followed, documenting 18 months of payments. Catherine had paid Blackwell over $18,000, worth millions in modern currency, to keep her Underground Railroad work secret. She'd bankrupted her household accounts, sold jewelry, taken loans against property she didn't own. The final entry was dated March 1862. The payments have ended. We have no more money to give. Nathaniel's business ventures have failed, though he does not yet know how badly. Blackwell came today, demanding another payment. I told him there was nothing left. He smiled and said he would find other sources. I fear what that means. I fear Oliver Blackwell more than I fear slave catchers, because at least the catchers are honest about their evil. Maggie looked at Walt, seeing her own realization reflected in his face. Theodore's family fortune was built on blackmail. Not just blackmail, blackmail of someone helping escape slaves. If this became public knowledge, Walt didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They photographed every page. Maggie's hands steadier now, despite the implications. This was evidence, not just of Catherine's courage, but of how the Blackwell wealth had been seeded, money taken through extortion, grown over generations, transformed into the respectable fortune Theodore now controlled. And it meant Nathaniel's warning in his journal wasn't about inheritance law or competing claims. It was about knowing that the Blackwells would do anything to prevent this story from emerging. Because if the source of their wealth was exposed as blackmail of an Underground Railroad conductor, the social cost would be catastrophic. Theodore Blackwell's careful reputation would shatter. His political connections would evaporate. His business partnerships would dissolve. Everything he'd built on his family name would collapse under the weight of how that name was bought. Helen returned an hour later, too excited about her discovery to notice the dust on their clothes or the way Maggie's backpack seemed fuller than before. She chattered about preliminary contacts at the Smithsonian, about grant applications for proper excavation, about the significance of finding an intact Underground Railroad station this far west. Maggie nodded and made appropriate sounds, her mind racing. She had evidence now. Evidence that could prove her claim to the estate and destroy Theodore simultaneously. But using it meant revealing secrets that could destroy more than just one man's reputation. The court date arrived with spring thaw. Maggie sat in the Boise courthouse wearing the best clothes she owned, a department store suit that Sarah had helped her pick out, shoes that pinched, hair pulled back in a style that suggested competence she didn't feel. Douglas's lawyer was everything Sarah had warned about: expensive, experienced, and utterly confident. Daniel Cross had the kind of smile that suggested he'd already won and was just here for the paperwork. He laid out Douglas's case with brutal efficiency: family trees, DNA evidence, legal precedent establishing equal inheritance rights among descendants of the same generation. The judge listened with the expression of someone who'd heard it all before and found most of it boring. Then Sarah stood. She was younger than Cross, less polished, wearing a suit she'd probably owned since law school. But when she spoke, her voice carried conviction that made even the judge lean forward. Your Honor, this isn't simply about bloodlines, it's about intent. Millicent Hayes knew about this property for 60 years. She searched for it, she documented its location, and when she finally accepted she wouldn't live to see it found, she made a specific choice about who should inherit. She submitted Millicent's will, annotated with the 2018 statute changes that allowed designated inheritance of undistributed estates. Then she presented affidavits from Walt, from the lawyers who'd drafted the will, from county officials who'd helped Millicent search. The testator demonstrated clear intent that Margaret Hayes should be the sole inheritor. Not because of genetic proximity, but because Miss Hayes possessed the qualities Millicent believed were necessary to properly steward this property. Namely, the determination to find what others considered lost, and the character to use wealth for more than personal enrichment. Cross objected, calling it character testimony rather than legal argument. The judge sustained but looked thoughtful. Then Walt took the stand and everything changed. Sarah had prepared him, but Maggie still held her breath as Walt described his decades searching for the mansion. The judge interrupted with questions about Millicent's intentions, about what she'd told Walt regarding future inheritance. Walt's answer was careful. Millicent said the house would reveal itself to someone who needed it badly enough to dig, without guarantee of reward. She believed that person would use what they found to help others, not just themselves. Cross-examined aggressively, trying to paint Walt as biased because of his friendship with Maggie. But Walt held firm, his military bearing lending credibility to every word. The judge called a recess. Maggie spent 90 minutes in the courthouse cafeteria, unable to eat, while Sarah reviewed her notes and Douglas's lawyer made confident phone calls. When they reconvened, the judge delivered his ruling with the kind of precision that suggested he'd made up his mind hours ago and just needed lunch before announcing it. The court finds that Millicent Hayes' will, executed in 2018 under the updated Idaho probate statutes, demonstrates clear and specific intent regarding the disposition of the Ashford estate. While Douglas Hayes has proven his genetic relationship to Nathaniel Ashford, genetic relationship alone is insufficient to override explicit testamentary intent under current law. Maggie's heart hammered. Therefore, the court rules in favor of Margaret Hayes. The estate and all property therein is her sole inheritance. Mr. Hayes may appeal this decision, but the immediate freeze on estate assets is lifted. Douglas exploded. His lawyer had to physically restrain him from approaching the bench, hissing about appeals and injustice and family rights. But the judge had already left, and security was already escorting them from the courtroom. Maggie stood shakily, Sarah gripping her arm, Walt beaming from the gallery. She'd won. The house was hers, the certificates were hers, the fortune was hers. But Theodore Blackwell had been in the courtroom too. Maggie caught his eyes as she walked past. He wasn't angry, he was calculating. And that was so much worse. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Sarah had warned her this would happen, coached her on what to say and what to avoid. Maggie kept it simple. She was grateful for the court's decision, looked forward to preserving the historical significance of the property, planned to honor her great-aunt's legacy. What she didn't mention was the journal in her backpack, the evidence of how the Blackwell fortune had been built, the weapon she wasn't sure yet how to use. Theodore found her before she could leave, pulling her aside with a grip on her elbow that looked friendly from a distance but felt like a threat up close. Congratulations on your victory, Miss Hayes, though I notice you still need permits to actually do anything with the property. Permits that, regrettably, seem to have encountered additional regulatory concerns. Maggie pulled her arm free. What do you want? I want to help you navigate the complex process of historic preservation. The council has questions about environmental impact, structural safety, archaeological significance. These things take time to resolve. Years, potentially. His smile never wavered. Unless, of course, someone with experience in local bureaucracy could expedite the process. In exchange for what? 20% management fee seems fair, given the services I'd be providing. Maggie thought about Catherine's journal, about $18,000 extorted from a woman trying to save lives, about 3 generations of Blackwell prosperity built on that foundation of theft. I don't need your help. Theodore's expression hardened. You don't understand how things work in this town. I have relationships, influence, the kind of connections that can make your life very easy or very difficult. Don't be foolish enough to choose difficulty. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. Think about it. He walked away, leaving Maggie standing in the courthouse parking lot with her victory feeling increasingly hollow. She'd won the legal battle, but Theodore had just declared war. Theodore's regulatory obstacles materialized within 48 hours of the court ruling. The environmental impact study returned with red flags requiring additional geological surveys before any construction could proceed. Structural engineering reports demanded seismic retrofitting specifications that would take months to develop. The archaeological assessment needed State Historical Commission review, a process notorious for year-long delays. Sarah spread the documents across her desk, each one a small masterpiece of bureaucratic obstruction. He's not breaking any laws. Everything here falls within the council's legitimate authority. But the timing, the interdependencies, The way each requirement triggers three more. This is warfare dressed as due diligence. Maggie stared at permits that carried Theodore's fingerprints despite his name appearing nowhere. How long can he sustain this? Years. The council requests studies. Studies take months and cost tens of thousands. By the time you satisfy one demand, he'll have manufactured new concerns. Sarah leaned back, exhaustion evident. You won the estate. He's making sure you can't use it. The legal system's elegant trap became clear. Maggie owned $15 million in stock certificates, but the physical mansion, the proof of her family's history, the structure that gave meaning to the money, remained locked behind paperwork Theodore controlled through council proxies. She made her decision, driving home through early summer rain. If Theodore wanted bureaucratic warfare, she'd give him something more dangerous: competition for public goodwill. The mansion might stay frozen, but the fortune could move freely, and money deployed wisely could accomplish what lawyers never would. The Ashford Foundation incorporated in Oregon 3 weeks later, outside Idaho's regulatory reach, but fully authorized to operate within it. Sarah handled the legal architecture. Walt managed community liaison. Bobby Chen agreed to serve as future construction director whenever permits finally cleared. The mission statement fit on a single page: preserve historical truth and support those the system overlooks. Maggie seeded the foundation with $5 million. Not a loan, not an investment, a commitment that this money would flow outward rather than accumulate behind walls. First grants went to scholarships, 20 full rides for local students whose grades deserved universities their families couldn't afford. Second round funded small business loans rejected by banks that saw risk instead of potential. Third grants established after-school programs providing meals and tutoring for children who needed both. Lily helped select that final category, reviewing applications with the seriousness of someone who remembered hunger. She pointed to one form. This girl's mom works 3 jobs like you did. She needs help. The foundation's launch made regional news. Local woman uses fortune to lift community. Photographs showed Maggie and Lily at the scholarship ceremony, both wearing clothes that fit properly now, both smiling like they'd finally earned the right. Theodore's countermove came through the town council within days. New ordinances requiring enhanced oversight for any charitable organization distributing over $1 million annually. Mandatory quarterly audits, registration fees that somehow applied retroactively to foundations established in the previous 90 days. Each requirement was technically lawful, each one designed to drown the Ashford Foundation in compliance costs rather than allowing it to distribute aid. But Sarah had anticipated exactly this response. She'd structured the foundation in Oregon specifically to avoid Idaho's jurisdiction. Theodore's new regulations applied to Idaho nonprofits. The Ashford Foundation, legally domiciled in Portland, merely operated programs in Idaho, a distinction that made his requirements unenforceable. The council meeting where this became public marked the first time Maggie saw Theodore lose composure. He stood at the podium, face reddening, as Sarah calmly explained why his proposed oversight didn't apply. Council members who'd rubber-stamped his previous demands now shifted uncomfortably, recognizing how the optics had transformed from protecting standards to blocking scholarships for local children. The vote failed 3-2. Theodore's reliable majority crumbled. He left without acknowledging anyone, but his glare at Maggie promised escalation of a different kind. Walt found her in the parking lot afterward. You just made an enemy willing to do whatever it takes. Marcus Blackwell cut my wife's brake lines for refusing to help him locate the mansion. Theodore's more sophisticated in his methods, but no less dangerous in his intent. Maggie had been calculating exactly that risk. 3 generations of Blackwell men who'd built power through intimidation and called it business acumen. Oliver extorting Catherine, Marcus terrorizing Walt's family, Theodore weaponizing bureaucracy. Then maybe people should know what the Blackwell fortune actually rests on. She showed Walt the photographs she'd made of Catherine's journal before returning the original to the Historical Society's climate-controlled archives. Every page documenting Oliver's extortion, every payment extracted from a woman trying to save lives. The ugly foundation beneath a century of manufactured respectability. Walt read in silence, his expression darkening with each revelation. When he finished, he looked at Maggie with something approaching fear. If you publish this, Theodore will destroy you. Defamation suits, forgery claims. He'll deploy every resource he has to bury you in litigation that lasts decades. Can he win? Doesn't matter. The process becomes the punishment. He'll tie you up in court for years, bankrupt the foundation through legal fees, make your existence so miserable you'll regret ever finding that house. Walt's hands trembled all slightly. Men like Theodore don't need to win. They just need to make fighting too expensive to continue. Maggie had spent 32 years being told what she couldn't do. Couldn't afford education. Couldn't save her marriage. Couldn't provide adequately for her daughter. Couldn't excavate a mansion from beneath a century of earth. Every impossibility had proven negotiable. I'm done letting men like him define what's possible. Dr. Helen Martinez spent 3 months cataloging the Underground Railroad station with academic precision that transformed curiosity into scholarship. She cross-referenced the names on the cellar walls with historical records, building a database of people who'd passed through Catherine Ashford's hidden rooms on their journey toward freedom. The Historical Society exhibition opened in June to modest fanfare. Local history enthusiasts, academic researchers, families seeking connections to ancestors who disappeared into the railroad's network. The displays included photographs of the cellar, careful reproductions of the names, contextual information about the Underground Railroad's presence in the Northwest. What the exhibition didn't include yet was Catherine's personal journal. Maggie had provided Helen with photocopies for authentication and research, but held the original back. Waiting, calculating, choosing the moment when revelation would carry maximum impact. That moment arrived when Theodore Blackwell attended the exhibition's opening. He moved through displays with practiced interest, performing the role of civic-minded community leader who supported historical preservation. Reporters followed, asking about his foundation's contributions to cultural institutions, contributions that had mysteriously materialized once the exhibition's public relations value became apparent. Maggie watched him position himself carefully in photographs, delivering sound bites about heritage and community responsibility. Then she stepped forward, Catherine's original journal in her hands. Mr. Blackwell, I thought you might find this particularly relevant. It documents your family's direct involvement in the period this exhibition commemorates. Theodore's professional smile didn't waver, but his eyes sharpened with calculation. I'm always interested in historical accuracy. Maggie opened the journal to the January 1859 entry. Her voice carried clearly across the suddenly quiet room. Oliver Blackwell discovered my secret. I was careless, and he followed me to the cellar. He threatened to report me to the authorities unless I paid him $500. I gave him the money from my household account. It was the first payment. Cameras pivoted toward them. Reporters abandoned other interviews. Theodore's smile finally cracked. She continued reading, each subsequent entry documenting payments, each amount accumulating toward a total that would be worth millions in modern currency, each word proving that the Blackwell fortune's seed capital derived from extorting a woman helping escaped slaves reach freedom. When she reached the final entry, Catherine's desperate notation that payments had ended only because Nathaniel's business had collapsed, the room remained silent. Theodore's carefully maintained composure had shattered completely. His face had transitioned from red to white, jaw clenched so tightly the muscles stood out. That journal is a forgery. His voice carried more fury than conviction. A transparent attempt to slander my family's reputation with fabricated documents. Helen stepped forward, academic authority in every syllable. I've authenticated this journal personally, Mr. Blackwell. The paper stock, ink composition, and handwriting analysis all confirm it matches Catherine Ashford's other documented correspondence from the identical period. The Historical Society's reputation stands behind its provenance. Then it's been deliberately misinterpreted. Business transactions from that era operated under different business transactions? Maggie's interruption cut through his deflection. She was hiding people fleeing slavery. Your great-grandfather threatened to have them captured and returned to bondage unless she paid him protection money. That's not business. That's extortion of the worst kind, profiting from the threat of returning human beings to slavery. Theodore looked at the reporters, the cameras, the crowd that had arrived expecting historical curiosity and discovered contemporary scandal. When he spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled rage. My family has contributed to this community for 3 generations. Millions donated to schools, hospitals, civic infrastructure. This malicious attempt to rewrite history with questionable documents represents nothing but a personal vendetta from someone who fundamentally misunderstands how respectable families operate. Maggie felt Walt tense beside her. Respectable families. The same phrase Marcus had probably used to justify terrorizing Walt's wife. The same justification Oliver had given himself while bleeding Catherine dry month after month. Your family built their respectability on money extorted from mine. I'm not rewriting history. I'm finally telling the truth about where your fortune actually originated. The story detonated across regional news that evening, national coverage by morning. Old Money's dark secret, how one fortune was built on blackmail. The narrative wrote itself perfectly. Wealthy establishment figure versus single mother, historical truth versus carefully curated lies, justice delayed but finally arriving. Theodore mobilized everything Walt had predicted. His lawyers filed defamation suits against Maggie, the Historical Society, and every media outlet that ran the story. They claimed Catherine's journal was fabricated, that her entries were being deliberately mischaracterized, that business disputes from the 1860s shouldn't be judged by contemporary moral standards. But Helen had built an airtight case. She produced Catherine's other journals, personal letters, household records, all showing consistent handwriting, identical paper stock, matching ink composition. She located bank records from the 1860s showing withdrawals that corresponded exactly with Catherine's documented payments to Oliver. She assembled evidence so comprehensive that even Theodore's expensive legal team couldn't penetrate it. Public opinion moved faster than legal proceedings. Theodore's business partners began distancing themselves from association with his name. Political endorsements evaporated as candidates recognized the toxicity of being linked to a fortune built on extorting someone who'd helped escaped slaves. The charitable foundation he'd run for 20 years hemorrhaged donors who didn't want their philanthropy connected to such origins. Maggie observed his carefully constructed empire fracturing, feeling none of the satisfaction she'd anticipated. Destroying Theodore didn't undo what Oliver had done to Catherine, didn't restore the $18,000 that might have saved Nathaniel's railroad business, didn't erase 3 generations of Blackwell prosperity built on that foundational theft. But it did ensure Theodore couldn't hurt anyone else the way his family had damaged hers. The permits cleared in August with remarkable speed, all of them simultaneously, accompanied by apologetic letters from council members explaining that previous requirements had been overly cautious. Theodore's influence had evaporated entirely, and without it, the bureaucratic obstacles disappeared like morning fog under direct sunlight. Bobby Chen mobilized restoration crews in September. The mansion required extensive structural reinforcement, new electrical systems meeting modern codes, plumbing that hadn't existed when the house was built, seismic retrofitting to ensure another century of survival. But the fundamental bones were extraordinary. Victorian-era craftsmen had built for permanence, assuming their work would serve generations rather than decades. Maggie hired locally whenever possible, drawing from workers the 2008 recession had devastated. Electricians who'd lost businesses, carpenters whose skills had gone unused for years, plumbers charging fair rates rather than exploiting desperation. The restoration became an economic engine, circulating money through a community that had been dying before she'd arrived with her apparently foolish dreams of excavating a buried house. The museum's conceptual framework emerged through conversations with Helen, Walt, and the dozen historians who'd contacted Maggie after Catherine's journal revelations became public. They would preserve the Underground Railroad station exactly as discovered. Names on walls protected behind climate-controlled glass. The mansion's main floor would be restored to approximate its appearance during Nathaniel's era. Furniture conserved, paintings cleaned, the chandelier repaired to full function. But the narrative they'd present wouldn't focus solely on wealth and architecture. The story would center Catherine's courage, the people she'd risked everything to help, and the genuine cost of opposing injustice when opposing it could mean prison or death. It would name the workers who'd built Nathaniel's railroad fortune, the immigrants who'd laid track for pennies, while company owners accumulated millions. The complete truth, uncomfortable elements included. Lily devoted her ninth birthday to designing the children's educational programming. She'd inherited her mother's stubbornness and redirected it toward ensuring young visitors understood that history wasn't merely names and dates on plaques. History was people making choices about what mattered more than personal comfort or safety. We should have a section about you digging in the snow, about people saying you were crazy but you kept going anyway. Maggie smiled, marveling at how thoroughly everything had transformed in 20 months. They lived in a genuine house now, 3 bedrooms, heat that functioned reliably, a yard where Lily could play without supervision. But they'd maintained the old apartment lease for another year, Maggie unable to fully trust that the money wouldn't somehow evaporate. Walt appeared while they reviewed architectural drawings, his expression carrying news. Theodore's liquidating everything. The commercial properties, rental houses, his development company stake. Complete exit. Maggie had expected to feel triumphant. Instead, exhaustion arrived. Where's he going? Arizona, apparently. Somewhere he can construct a new identity. Walt sat heavily. His children aren't speaking to him. His wife filed for divorce. He transformed from respected community leader to pariah in 8 months. He paused. I should feel vindicated, given what his father did to my wife. Mostly I just feel tired. He could have apologized, could have acknowledged what Oliver did and attempted meaningful amends. Men like Theodore don't apologize. They either double down or disappear. Walt studied the museum plans spread across the table. You accomplished what 3 generations of Ashfords couldn't. You made the buried secrets matter more than the accumulated money. The bank transferred $14.7 million on a Tuesday morning in late September. Maggie checked the balance 3 times, certain the numbers would shift or reveal themselves as errors. They didn't. Yesterday, she'd had $412. Today, she possessed more money than she could spend across 3 lifetimes. She purchased heat first, called the utility company, paid all arrears plus 6 months advance. Then bought Lily clothes that actually fit, a winter coat without holes, boots designed for Idaho snow rather than Montana hand-me-downs. Small purchases, careful choices, the kind that wouldn't attract attention from people who had spent months watching her excavate frozen ground. The museum opened on a Saturday in July, precisely 2 years after Maggie had first driven to Idaho and stared at an anonymous hill of snow. The entire town attended. People who'd mocked her brought their children to witness what persistence actually looked like. Volunteers who'd helped excavate stood in rooms they'd uncovered, experiencing pride mixed with wonder. Eleanor Kim found Maggie in the entrance hall, tears streaming freely. You understand what you've accomplished, don't you? You didn't just excavate a house. You excavated hope itself. The Underground Railroad exhibit drew crowds that surprised even Helen's optimistic projections. Visitors arrived from across the country, academic historians, descendants of escaped slaves, families attempting to trace ancestors who'd vanished into the network of safe houses and courageous conductors. They stood in Catherine's preserved cellar reading names on walls, connecting their personal histories to this moment of documented bravery. One elderly woman moving carefully with a cane stopped Maggie near the exhibit entrance. My great-great-grandmother was named Rebecca. She escaped on Christmas 1858. Family legend always said she came through a station in Idaho territory, but we never knew where. Until now. They located Rebecca's name together, written in charcoal that had survived a century and a half underground. The woman traced the letters with trembling fingers, crying too hard for speech. Maggie stood beside her, finally understanding what the mansion meant beyond money or personal victory. This was memory made physical. Proof that people had chosen righteousness over safety, had risked everything for strangers, had left marks on walls, ensuring someday someone would know their names. The foundation expanded beyond what Maggie had initially imagined. By the second year's conclusion, they distributed $12 million, 200 scholarships awarded, 75 small business grants funded, after-school programs operating in 4 counties. Every dollar allocated according to the same principle. Help people who reminded her of herself. People the system had instructed to accept circumstances and be grateful for crumbs. Lily initiated a junior archaeologist program at the museum. 12 children learning proper excavation techniques, historical research methodologies. the patience required to uncover truths buried under time and accumulated earth. They practiced in sandboxes initially, but Maggie was already surveying other properties. Who knew what else lay hidden, waiting for someone sufficiently determined to dig? Walt became the museum's director of historical preservation, though primarily he appeared to debate interpretation choices with Helen and share excavation stories with visitors. He'd recovered something Maggie hadn't realized he'd lost: purpose beyond mourning his wife, beyond the quiet bitterness of watching Marcus Blackwell prosper while his own family suffered. "You gave me my life back. You understand that?" They sat on the mansion's front steps, observing sunset over mountains that had witnessed centuries of human struggle and triumph. Maggie shook her head. "You gave me shovels when I had nothing except apparently crazy ideas. This is what we built together. No, this is what you built by refusing to accept what everyone insisted was impossible." I just held the flashlight. The second anniversary celebration was smaller than the opening, but carried deeper meaning. Attendees weren't tourists or journalists, but the volunteers who'd excavated frozen ground, the scholarship recipients pursuing degrees they'd believed unaffordable, the business owners who'd survived because someone finally gave them opportunity. Marcus the mechanic brought his granddaughter, recipient of a foundation scholarship, now studying engineering. Eleanor's son Josh was heading to college on a full scholarship, his application essay describing how he'd learned that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things through sufficient stubbornness. Maggie stood at the podium, looking at familiar faces, lives she'd touched, futures she'd made possible. The prepared speech felt inadequate, too formal for what this moment actually meant. She spoke from her heart instead. 3 years ago, people laughed at a desperate woman digging in dirt. Today we stand in a place that creates jobs, preserves history, and reminds us that nothing stays buried forever. Not houses, not truth, not hope. She paused, locating Lily in the crowd. Her daughter smiled, wise beyond her years, already planning the next impossible thing. Every one of us carries something buried. Some dream everyone declared worthless, some potentials the world instructed us to forget. I'm here to tell you, start digging. And if you need help, look around. We've gotten remarkably good at it. The applause built gradually, then swelled to fill the mansion's grand hall. But Maggie was already contemplating the letter that had arrived that morning. Another property, another inheritance someone had refused as worthless. A flooded silver mine that historical records suggested might contain an untapped vein. Probably nothing. Probably foolish to even consider. But she'd heard that assessment before. That evening, after crowds dispersed and the museum closed, Maggie found Lily in the library surrounded by geological surveys and historical mining reports. Her daughter looked up with eyes reflecting Maggie's own stubbornness back at her. "The water table shifted in 1953. If we could pump it out, the lower tunnels might still be accessible." Maggie sat beside her daughter, studying maps that promised nothing and suggested everything. Mother and daughter planning their next excavation, proving that the best things in life require dirty hands and stubborn hearts. The mansion rose around them, no longer buried, no longer forgotten. A monument to persistence, community, and the truth that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't discovered at the bottom of holes. They're found in the strength required to keep digging when everyone insists you stop. Outside, stars appeared over Idaho mountains. Tomorrow would deliver new challenges, new doubts, new voices demanding they be reasonable and know their place. But tonight, a woman who'd started with nothing except desperation and a shovel sat with her daughter and dreamed about what else might be waiting underground. Because Maggie Hayes had learned the secret that a century of burial had protected. Real treasure isn't what we inherit, but what we're willing to uncover. And once you start digging, genuinely digging, there's no predicting what wonders wait below the surface.